Oh my, it sounds like you guys almost got talked out today. This is like the first time. So today we are continuing our session on this chapter 2 through 8 and really looking at the establishment of David as a king. In chapter 6, we have to start with Hiram, the king of Tyre. Tyre is related to another city. They almost always appear together in the Bible. What's the other city? Sidon. So if you looked on a map at the north end of Israel, you will see, and this is actually the same today. I think most of these older names are still there, but you'll see modern day Haifa. There's this part of Israel where there's kind of a lip and it curves out into the Mediterranean a little bit. That's where Haifa is. And then if you go further north along the coast, you'll come to Acre, which if you're reading a history of the Crusades, Acre is where some of the major battles happened. And then further north are Tyre and Sidon. Now I think they are in the territory of Lebanon. Beirut itself might be close to one of them. I'm not exactly sure. I think this Bible. What? You were looking at a map. That is an excellent choice. Are Tyre and Sidon in Lebanon? Okay, so these were two important coastal cities, but they're relatively unique in the ancient world because they don't begin to establish a large kingdom. They're Phoenicians, and so they're related by blood in some fashion to the Philistines and to some of these other groups of people that inhabited the coasts around the Mediterranean. They move into those areas at the time period, probably of the Judges, when that upheaval was happening. We talked about that transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and how much social upheaval there is at that time. So Tyre is a trading city. It is where a lot of goods come because it has a good port. One of the problems in ancient Israel is that it doesn't have good port facilities. This is something that we don't think about. To have a port, especially in the ancient world, what do you need to start with? We have a few scuba divers here that should know this. What do you start with when you want to make a port? Water, but you need something more than that. Or you who have lake homes should be able. You need some kind of barrier protection. You want a beach, but you also want something else. You guys are just land lovers. A dock. Nope. So what you actually need is a relatively steep underwater bank. You don't want, some areas have, hundreds of feet of salt flats or a shallow area where the water isn't very deep. To have a natural harbor, you actually can't use that because the big ships are too heavy and they'll run aground. And if you have to unload the big ships off of port, it doesn't work very well. So what you need is called a deep water harbor. This is part of what made cities like New York so attractive for the United States and why New York developed the way it did. Because the harbor is deep, so you can float ships up really close to the land, and then the dock that you have to build is not as huge. Now, lots of areas to have some kind of natural breakwater, some kind of shelter from the prevailing winds, that definitely is important, but you need some depth of the ocean to sail the bigger ships in. And until the techniques of modern dredging, Israel doesn't have a great one. It's part of the reason why Caesarea is established on the coast later by the Romans, but there just isn't a lot of possibility because it's a relatively gradual slope. This makes a big difference at lakes, for instance. If you have a lake bed that gets deep relatively quickly, you don't have the same problem with weeds that you do if you have a relatively shallow area that you have to drive through, where the water heats up, the sunlight is better, and the seaweed grows like crazy. So this is a little bit about Tyre and Sidon. They're on this coast of Lebanon. They're a bit north of Israel. But I think that it's good to have a little bit of a sense of this, because Tyre and Hiram is the first international recognition of Israeli kingship. This is the first time that someone outside themselves is sort of calling them king or treating them as equals. The Philistines, for instance, certainly didn't see the early Jews led by Saul as their equals. They thought of them as slaves or as servants or people that weren't worth very much. And so there was a lot of tension back and forth between Israel and its neighbors. So as we talk about the establishment of the kingdom, one of the other things that I think is important to have a sense of is Israel is not a large country. It's very, very small. And I've mentioned before that so much of Jewish history is actually not related to Jews at all. It's dominated by some foreign powers. Who are the foreign powers in the area that attack them or conquer them or they're fighting between? The Romans, yes, but they won't come until later. We're in the year about 1000 BC or 950 BC, give or take, this establishment of the kingdom of David. So the Romans don't come for 900 years. The Philistines. That's a decent answer, but remember the Philistines have 5 major cities on the Israeli coast, so they are only a region of Israel. We need some bigger powers than that. Egypt is one. Yes. Persia. But who inhabits Persia? The Babylonians are another one. And there's one more major group. The Assyrians, with an A, that have their capital in Nineveh. Remember the story of Jonah? So the Assyrians capture the northern kingdom. They have the first exile. Egypt is extremely powerful at this time overall, especially compared to Israel. It'd be a little bit like Russia fighting Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, the Baltic republics. None of them, all of them are about 5 million people, and you can't fight a nation with 140 million people. It doesn't work. If the Russians would have invaded Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, they could have won the battle extremely easily, but for those countries are in NATO. But just comparatively the size, Egypt is an extreme power in the area, and the Eastern empires, Babylonia ends up being in southern Iraq, modern-day Iraq, and Assyria is in the northern part of modern-day Iraq. Eventually, the Persians under Cyrus become another major player in the region. But it's just important to have a sense of this, because we're like, oh, the kingdom of Israel, and they're subject to all these foreign nations, and they have all of these fights. But the kingdom of Israel may have been, I wouldn't be surprised if it's something like 1 million people under David and Solomon. And that sounds like a lot of money, or a lot of people, but not for the size of the empires around them. I mean, the Roman Empire at its height, they expect held within it between 15 and 20 million people, maybe 25. But that was scattered from modern-day Spain and North Africa to the Gulf Coast, to the Persian Gulf, all along there. And that was only 15 to 20 million people. Like, we just have no concept of this because today, in our megacities, there's more people in one city than there were in the ancient Roman Empire. You know, there's more people in the New York metropolitan area than there were in all of the ancient Roman Empire. Like, our concept of size is just very different. So the king of Tyre and Sidon recognizing Israel is somewhat of a big deal. Now, in some ways, this is a little bit ironic because Tyre and Sidon don't become dominant political powers in the region. Instead, they're a little bit like the ancient equivalent of Switzerland. They trade with everyone, and they sort of remain officially neutral. And so they don't get conquered nearly as much as the belligerents in the war because everyone uses them for trading because they happen to have deep water ports on the eastern side of the Mediterranean where you can import goods from further west. So there is a trading relationship. Israel sends food to Tyre, better land for growing. Another thing that we just have a bizarre concept of compared to Israel is the amount of arable or farmable land that we have in our nation. Again, you know, one of the things that makes the United States unique, I forget how much of our land is arable, but it's actually crazy high compared to many countries in the rest of the world. Now, this is for larger scale farming. You can plant gardens just about anywhere, and you can grow food on a small scale relatively easily. But to grow it on an industrial scale to feed a nation, you need arable land where you have enough water and enough loose soil that isn't too rocky. Like, you need all these different characteristics. So we live on this giant chunk of arable land that stretches pretty much from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to, I don't know how far, almost to the Appalachians. And most of the land between them is farmable, which is crazy. If you look at a country like modern day Saudi Arabia, I think something like less than 1% of their land is farmable. And most of that is only farmable through irrigation. So there's just a difference. Ancient Israel doesn't have all that much arable land. It's very, very hilly. It's up and down a lot. And you can grow stuff on the tops of hills, but then you run out of water because it all drains down, and you can grow stuff at the bottom of hills in the valleys. That's where they often did. But those fields and your ability to grow there is relatively narrow based on the steepness and the grade of the land. Like, all of that plays into this story of the people of Israel. And we'll feel more of that when we talk about Jerusalem. So the Lord established David as king. This is a long process that's been in the works in the life of David. Remember that he was anointed king years, even decades ago, by Samuel. And he's been fighting with Saul, and he's had all of that, the conflict with the Philistines. Now he's finally becoming king. And he recognizes that this is not his own doing, that this isn't something that he did himself. It's something that God was doing. God was establishing his house. And house, in this sense, is closely related to the word that we would have dynasty, his family line and the family inheritance in the rule of Israel. Then it tells a story of David having more children and more wives. If you remember, there was that series of 6 kids with 6 different women that happened in the beginning of this section. Now there's more children with even more wives. And that will come back to haunt David later. that plays into the story because many of his children end up trying to seize the kingdom from him. And a civil war starts, particularly with Absalom. But some of his other children were involved in it, and that had to tear at his heart. And so it's interesting that even here, there's this kind of balanced perspective between the good things that David did and his love of the Lord and bad things. For now, the bad things or the sins are more in the background, but very soon they're going to break into the open. He has 2 more fights with the Philistines, and what I would say about this is each time he needs to fight the Philistines, he consults the Lord. And that's such an important theme because of the history. Why would the Bible be at pains to emphasize when David's going to battle, he asks God if it's the right thing? Because Saul never did, exactly. So what it's showing is a contrast. Saul was in it for himself. Saul was like, how many soldiers do I have? How smart am I? David's like, what does the Lord say? No, objectively, David is a good military commander. As one of my professors one time said, there's no evidence that he ever lost a battle in his life, which is pretty incredible. Even some of the great ones in World War II, like many of the German commanders, for instance, were at least as good as the Allied ones, sometimes dramatically better. And the reason they lost the war wasn't because of a lack of leadership. It was a lack of material and manpower at the end. If they would have had the material and the manpower, just based on leadership alone, some of them were devastating. In the Civil War, for instance, Richard E. Lee, militarily, is a much better general than Ulysses Grant. Grant just threw piles of men at enemy lines until they overwhelmed them. It was sort of like the Russian tactics in this Ukrainian war, where Robert E. Lee saves a battle several times by being a relative genius. So if he had the manpower and he had the authority, he very well could have won the Civil War. It's just the southern states didn't have as many people as the northern states, and they didn't have the industrial base. It was a farming region, and so they eventually lost. But those kind of things, this contrast between David, who has his heart set on the Lord, and Saul, is really, really incredible. And you see that it's a counter to pride. There's a humility to it. If God says don't go, David doesn't go. If God says go, then he does. And sometimes the odds didn't look like they were in his favor, but he follows what the Lord asks him to do. I think that's a good theme for us to think of.
Was the Lord talking to him then?
Was the Lord talking to him? Well,
Doesn't he talk to me?
so how was the Lord talking to David? That's a great question. Part of it is that David has a relationship with Abiathar, who was the priest. He has this connection to the priests that, some of them were massacred by Saul at Nob, the priestly city, if you remember that, but there were other priests. So how does David talk to the Lord? Some of it is his own personal prayer, I think. Remember that he's the quoted author of many of the Psalms. Some of it is that he used, they had this set of sacred dice that they rolled. It just sounds so bizarre to us, but it's just there. They were called the Urim and the Thummim, and they were in the breastplate that the high priest wore. Somehow they had these things that were in there that they would roll or cast lots for, like dice. I think there's a lot of it that we don't know. When you ask, why doesn't the Lord speak to me? That I think is one of the really great questions of Christianity. Part of it is our own work of investing in growing in our prayer and learning methods and ways of praying that open our hearts to God. But a lot of it, the Lord seems very content to rely on faith, to rely on people choosing to believe in him, to rely on those kind of things. So learning to pray better is a really good thing to do And I would only encourage you in it, but it's certainly not always an easy thing to do. Okay, this brings up the theme of worship and battle. So in the ancient world, a battle was the thought, like, our God is fighting your God. Whose God is greater? And they had that sense. And it's one of the reasons why, if you remember the Philistines early on in 1 Samuel, when the Israelites bring the ark to their camp, they think, this has never happened to us before, where the God is actually coming to fight us himself. Like, we're all going to die. They're going to make us their slaves. We better fight hard so that their God doesn't capture us. But it connects the battle to worship. And I think that's a really, really valuable connection to make. Sometimes we have conflicts, not on the level of a war. Hopefully, you haven't fought a war in your family where you're stabbing each other with swords. I hope that's not the case. But we have conflicts in our own life and in our own families. Sometimes conversations that we want to go well. And I think this is a really powerful example of it, or the cultural battle that we're having today, that we need to connect fighting the battle to the worship of God. That worship is part of the victory, that seeking the heart of the Lord and opening our hearts to prayer, we are doing battle. I think that language and the military sense of it is diminishing a little bit, which is probably okay, because battle can be really challenging. But it's not a bad image. The scriptures use it. It talks about the spiritual battle and the sharp arrows and darts of temptation that faith protects you from. That's an image that St. Paul uses. So when you find battles in your life, battles with a spouse, battles with your family, I think hearing that as a call to pray and to open your heart to God is a good place to start. Be like David. Think of worship and prayer as part of dialogue and communication and entering into the fight. So shortly after David, did we get to Jerusalem already? Oh, we did. Okay, so Jerusalem at this time, just remember, is maybe like 5,000 people. And the city is probably smaller than the block that Holy Spirit sits on. They weren't large places. Even if you go to Jerusalem today and you go to the old city, it's more than double the size of what it was in the time of Jesus. Because now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is almost in the middle of the old city, and that's outside the walls of the city in Jesus' time. It's one of the reasons why there aren't a lot of roads from the side of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre into the rest of the old city. They had to punch holes in walls and make these doorways and gates, because that's where part of that ancient wall was. So David, shortly after he captures Jerusalem, he sets out immediately to bring the ark. Again, you can see his faithfulness. He wants to bring the ark of God to him. At least in the story, it happens quickly. We don't know how quick it was in his life, but the story makes it sound like it happens quickly. And he sets out with 30,000 men and women and people. It's not clear where they are from. This may have been most of the people of his kingdom. Like, this is a huge group. He's going in this kind of great triumphal procession to the Lord. And again, this just has a very different feel from the time of Saul. Saul kind of sought the Lord a little bit and, did some things on the side. David is wholehearted in this. He is like, not only am I going to go get the ark, but you all and everyone else and your dogs and your cats and your children and everyone is going to come with. So they go, they find the ark in the house of Abinadab. House here could be, it probably wasn't like in his living room. Like, oh yeah, that's the ark. Like, just sits there. Nice ark. Right? Because you're not supposed to touch it. So it probably wasn't in his house. It was probably in a temple of some kind, but it's not really talked about. Abinadab is one of the priests related or descended from Eleazar. And they put the ark on a cart that is pulled by oxen. If you read Exodus carefully, that's one of the things that they're not supposed to do. What is supposed to happen with the ark? People are supposed to carry it. There were these long poles that were like 15 or 20 feet long that were stuck through these rings on the side of it, that it would be used to carry it between them. And not just people are supposed to carry it, but specifically Levites from the tribe of Levi. They're supposed to be the ones that have charge of carrying and moving the ark. So they put it on a cart. And it's like, uh-oh, you're not supposed to do that. So they have this giant celebration. It says that David celebrates and worships God with all his might. You know, he dances kind of outrageously, so much so that later the daughter of Saul will get angry with him and say that he demeaned himself in the sight of the people. He worships with abandon. And again, I think this is a great question for us to reflect on. Could you be charged with worshiping the Lord with all your might like this? Is that something that would fit into your life? For lots of us, the answer is not really. You know, we think of worship as something quiet. You kneel, you pray, and those kind of things. And that's certainly not a bad way to pray, but it's just, this is a different flavor. Like David is almost overcome with rejoicing at being in the presence of the ark. And I think that is a valuable question to ask, something to reflect on. Sometimes it's worth being a little bit uncomfortable or to be extravagant, to be over the top in your prayer, in your love of God. I think that's a good thing to strive for. It notes that they use musical instruments. This, I think, is one of the oldest references to musical instruments that we have. Lots of musical instruments. We know that they had them, but this is a direct reference to them being sort of organized and played. So as they're doing this, as David is worshiping, the oxen stumble that the cart was on, probably because the ground is rocky. I gather that an ox that falls over is a rather grouchy creature that isn't having the best day. And so this is where this guy named Uzzah sticks out his hand to stop the ark from falling, and then God kills him. And again, it's a little bit like, why? You know, that sounds a bit dramatic to us today. You know, like if a ciborium of host dropped on the floor, someone could help pick it up and wouldn't be afraid of God smiting them. You know, that you'd vaporize in a cloud of cinders. It'd be pretty dramatic. But it does here, and I think it's related to they're not supposed to have the ark on a cart. It's supposed to be carried by people. It doesn't say, what do you do if the people fall down? But somehow that doesn't get to be part of the story. So the oxen stumble. But this also serves to give David caution. It helps him recognize the holiness of God and that this isn't just a small thing. This is the ark. It carries his presence. He seems to have thought of bringing it to his palace, of bringing it to his house, or whatever he lived in at that time. And when Uzzah dies, he says, well, maybe we'll put it out there, just in case. You know, this God seems able to defend himself, so we'll leave it in a place. So he leaves it with this guy named Obed-Edom, something like that. And I think this story is in the text to show us that it's important not to be careless with the things of God. It's important to honor them, to try to do our best, to try to take care of it. the importance of following his commands, that faith isn't blind, that he does have a set of commands. You're not going to be saved just because you have the physical ark. You have to actually love God. God remains other and separate from his people. And this is important to us today because we have a sense, you can have a strong sense of Jesus as a man, of Jesus as a friend, that Jesus is approachable, and all of that is good. But it's important to remember that Jesus is also God, that he is divine, and that God is, that we are far away from him, like creature to creator, speck of dust to mountain, is in some ways a closer distance than creature to creator. And we're invited to share in his divinity. We're invited to enter into and share our lives with him. And that speaks very highly of our dignity as creatures, the gift of God in raising us up to his level. So the house of Obed-Edom is blessed, and David's like, well, maybe he's not so scary after all. He has him at his house, and it's going well for him. So I want it to go well for me. Why don't I bring the ark up to my house? And so he comes to bring the ark a second time. This time, note, he has people carry it. It's not on a cart. It's not with oxes. And he offers sacrifices before it. In fact, great amounts of sacrifices. Some of it, the story makes it sound like he is almost terrified of this. And so he's like, yes, I will sacrifice like 6,000 animals. I only need 2 of them, but 6,000 because we want to make the Lord happy. And, to do this, and he does it extremely or extravagantly, that kind of thing. And he dances wearing a linen ephod. This can sound strange to us, but linen was a very expensive fabric, and it's mandated for the priest to wear, not the people. The people wore more wool that they would get from sheep. I think they had cotton at this time as well, so they would wear cotton clothing. I think they had it. It wasn't common, but it was part of their, society. But he wears a linen ephod. He's wearing a priestly garment. Now this should strike your ears about like nails on a chalkboard. Why? David isn't a Levite. Exactly. And the Levites and the family of Aaron were the anointed priests of Israel. But David is here offering sacrifices and worshiping before the Lord in priestly garments, and he's not a Levite. What's going on? Why doesn't God smite him for breaking his commandment? He smited the other guy. Well, it seems to be connected to a concept of priesthood that is older.